and a very warm welcome to our 141st Thought Leadership webinar. And we are here from now on every Thursday afternoons at this time, where we'll be looking at the subject matter of interest to the security world, where what we're trying to do is critique it. The idea of thought leadership is that we analyze today what's going on, and that we might have a better way of thinking about problems going forward. And I know that many students and many researchers and many of those who are at the sharp end of practice enjoy these, because we get experts talking about what are the important issues in a very, very short space of time. And today the topic is one that I think is fascinating. Why are financial crimes such a low priority, and what should we do? And here's the point. In many countries, and the UK is just but one example, financial crimes are the single biggest offence type. And what we are learning is some of the impacts of financial crime, not least losing a lot of money and not being able to get it back, have devastating consequences on people and organisations. And yet the law enforcement focus is somewhat different to that priority, different to that reality. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be analysing this in a bit more detail. And I've got three panellists to help me go through the process. What I'm going to do in a second is I'm going to invite each of them to just introduce themselves, and when they've done that, to make their opening statement. 3 minutes when they get to say whatever they want to about the subject matter. And while they're doing that, I would encourage you, the audience, please, to ask questions. Please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And if you get your question in early, I will endeavour to incorporate it in the ensuing discussion. So question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and I will endeavour to get to it. Okay, without further ado, let's go and meet our panellists. And first of all, I'm going to invite Janice to introduce herself. Janice, you come and say hello.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for asking me to take part in this webinar, and good afternoon to everyone else. My name is Janice Goldstraw-White, and I'm currently working as a researcher for Martin at Perpetuity. I have nearly 40 years experience in financial crime, first 20 working in the areas of governance, assurance, audit, counter fraud and risk management, mainly in the public sector. Then after attaining my PhD in the motivation and rationalisation of white-collar crime offenders, I've spent the latter half of my career as a criminologist, researching financial and economic crimes. I've widely published in these areas, and my own book, White Collar Crime Accounts of Offending Behaviour, was published in 2011.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Well worth a read, that book, by the way. Offenders' Perspectives. Okay, without further ado, let's go to Tim. Tim, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good afternoon, Martin. Thank you for inviting me. Good afternoon to everybody else. I'm a career detective. I joined the Metropolitan Police in 1979, worked in Central and South London before transferring to New Scotland Yard, where I worked as a detective inspector, chief inspector and detective superintendent of the Economic Crime Department. I then transferred to the City of London Police and worked there as the detective superintendent for the Economic Crime Department before retiring from the force. I now work as a private consultant. I also am director of Fraud Training Limited, a fraud training company that delivers the training for the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, for which I also work. The ACFE is the biggest anti-fraud association in the world. And that's me.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. And now let's go to David.
Yeah. Hello there, good to see everybody, and thanks for inviting us back on to speak to you. 141, that's amazing. Feels like no time at all. I'm David Clarke. I'm chairman of the Fraud Advisory Panel charity, independent voice of the counter fraud profession. We've been around for about 23 years now, formed by the Institute of Chartered Accountants. I've been a trustee for 12 years. And I joined actually when I was on the fraud review a million years ago. I used to be actually with Tim. I was with the City of London Police. I had the enviable job of establishing the National Lead Force for Fraud, National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, and things like that. When I left, I stayed on as a trustee. I now am a director for integrity at a company called Guildhawk. We're a technology-led, AI-powered language business, and we do all manner of products, including secure translation work and avatars. I'm now an avatar, which presented our AGM, and people said it was better than me. So there you go. I'm like a broken record who's better as an avatar.
Well, that's a claim to fame. Well, thank you very much indeed, panel. And I just want to say for the audience, one of the sort of inspirations for this was that, and it involves all our three panelists in different ways today, the Fraud Advisory Panel and the Association Certified Fraud Examiners came together and involved myself and Janice in a study to understand whether the mandatory reporting of fraud was a good idea or not. And it sparked this idea that we need to do something about why economic crime is such a low priority. So making it mandatory was one such thing. So after the webinar, we'll let you know all about where you can get a copy of the report. Meanwhile, though, let's see what our panelists have got to say for themselves about this topic. Now I'm going to go to each of their opening statement. Let's go to Janice first. Janice, 3 minutes, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. The UK is one of the world's leading financial centres, but one of estimates from the telephone operated crime survey for England and Wales this year showed that there were 4.6 million fraud offences recording for the year ending 2021. And that was a 24% increase compared to previous years. And although COVID's had a significant impact on crime patterns, fraud is now widely acknowledged as the most common crime in the UK, accounting for approximately 39% of all recorded crimes. And although the cost of fraud to the UK is a debatable topic and probably a webinar all on its own, it could amount to up to sort of 200 billion a year for the UK. But it's widely agreed that we lose more financially to fraud than any other type of organised crime, and this results in funds being channelled out of the UK and into the criminal economy. As well as the general cost of fraud, it also has other devastating effects, as Martin alluded to, on both individuals and businesses. It can result in loss of businesses and jobs, lost government revenue through taxes, and those taxes go towards funding public services. It has a psychological impact. Around a third of victims of fraud say they have suffered a significant emotional or psychological impact as a result. It also goes towards assisting other crimes. Fraud is closely connected with organised criminal activities such as cybercrime, especially identity theft, money laundering, funding terrorism, people trafficking, corruption and counterfeiting. Therefore, fraud has a significant impact on the UK's economy, competitiveness, citizens and institutions and reputation. And what's more, it undermines all three of the government's national security objectives. Those are to protect our people, to protect our global influence, and to promote our prosperity. So what evidence do we have to actually make us believe that fraud is such a low priority to the government? To answer this, we need to look back a little bit at how white-collar crimes have been viewed over time. In the 1930s, when we first talked about them, they were only thought to apply to individuals of respectability and high social status. And although there were some changes over the next few decades on definitions, and in other words, they were seen to apply more to large businesses that harm few people. In the 90s, the advent of the internet and the focus on corporate governance brought a renewed interest in fraud, resulted in a government-led review, the introduction of the Fraud Act, and more recently, the formation of Action Fraud and the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau. But since then, government interest in fraud seems to have waned a little. The last national strategy for tackling fraud, for example, was published in 2011 by an agency that no longer exists. And the absence of such a strategy means that there is weak and dispersed accountability throughout the system for tackling fraud. And prosecutions for these offences are abysmally low, although official statistics have been affected by the COVID pandemic in the last couple of years. Evidence prior to that suggests that the number of white-collar crime prosecutions were already low compared to other crimes and were falling further at the same time the number of reported fraud offences rose. In fact, the Fraud Advisory Panel suggested that 1 in 500 of reported cases, only 1 in 500 reported fraud cases get to court, and prosecution rates and those who go to jail are even lower, much lower than for other criminal offences. Fraud investigations also take much longer than other criminal investigations, with the average length of time of reporting charging over 500 days compared to just 50 days, for example, for theft offences. And it takes on average just over 50 days from a fraud being reported to Action Fraud to the case being allocated for investigation. People are more likely to become victims of fraud than any other crime as well, as highlighted recently by the Victims Commissioner report published earlier this month. And this problem has worsened during the pandemic, where criminals took advantage of behaviour changes during lockdown and other restrictions. So, however, despite the vast scale of fraud offending affecting us, the police and criminal justice response remains limited by comparison with other crimes. Many police and crime plans hardly mention economic crime and rarely have it as a priority. Some don't even mention it at all. Instead, they concentrate on more visible or publicly popular issues like violent offences, drugs, gangs, burglary and child protection. At perpetuity, as Martin said, we recently completed a research project for the ACFE and Fraud Advisory Panel about whether reporting of fraud should be made mandatory. Survey respondents and those we spoke to believed that this was one good way that fraud could be elevated on the government's agenda, certainly by highlighting a clear understanding of the scale of the problem. In many comments we had from survey respondents, some felt that the continuing low priority approach by the government is in effect normalising fraud and certainly sending out the wrong message to fraudsters and would-be fraudsters. In terms of people being pursued for the non-reporting of fraud, respondents felt that this was unlikely to happen because they felt that fraud was such a low priority for the government generally that even those committing frauds were not pursued, let alone those who didn't report having come across a fraud. Taking all these facts that I've outlined together, the main reasons I believe fraud is low priority on the agenda for the government are, firstly, they are interested in more visible, allegedly more harmful violent crimes. Fraud, as Martin said, is not the first type of crime you think of when you think of a victim. And often these crimes are hidden for many years and do not have an obvious victim. And often people don't always know they've been a victim or don't think of themselves as a victim. Secondly, fraud is a difficult issue to tackle in many ways. It spans a wide range of acts and it is not viewed like other volume crimes. Yet that's what it's become. It is complex and does not fit the usual police models for other everyday crimes. Thirdly, it's political. It's not on the police and crime commissioners' agendas, who prefer to concentrate on more politically sensitive crimes. And fourthly, although many frauds are committed via the internet, not all are, and attention and possibly resources have recently tended to focus more on cybercrime in some areas to the detriment of fraud. And we know from our own research that that's all traditional frauds still exist very much so, but aren't paid the attention they should be. So, however, we have to be realistic about what can be achieved. And although I've hopefully outlined a case that recognised fraud deserves greater attention from policymakers and law enforcement agencies, should the government prioritise fraud? Interestingly, in an Ipsos Mori poll in 2017, it showed that when the public were asked about this, which offences should be among the top 3 priorities for policing, 61% said violent crimes, 54% said terrorism and extremism, and 50% said rape and other sexual offences. Only actually 4% mentioned fraud, a low priority for the public than online abuse and drug offences. Therefore, given the public's relative lack of concern, it's not surprising that politicians and the police do not prioritise fraud, especially within the current demands and at a time when budgets are severely stretched. It is perhaps understandable to some extent that fraud has not received a greater strategic focus. However, we know that
I should sum up now because it's
yeah, on the last couple of lines.
Okay.
However, we know that fraud is one of the most pervasive crimes in the UK. The costs, both direct and indirect, are immense, and we still don't have one overall strategy to deal with it. The government must therefore start to take an interest in fraud again and prioritise resources to deal with it if we are to push the agenda forward on tackling fraud.
Okay, thank you, Janice. Really appreciate that. Tim, your 3 minutes. Hopefully try and get this to 3 minutes if we can, Tim.
I've nothing to add. that was absolutely excellent, Janice. I mean, that really does sum it up. I mean, as I say, I've been in law enforcement. I started in 1979, and I've been watching the crime trends. And year on year, fraud has been the statistic that's always grown. Robbery, rape, violent crime, there's been ups and downs, but fraud's continually grown, even though the Home Office twice changed the Home Office counting rules to try and make the number a little smaller. Now, the difficulty with fraud was, according to the government, we don't think there's a problem. We don't think there's a problem because we can't count it. So to give you an example of this, theft of Lucy's pencil case from school was recorded as theft, Section 1 theft. Theft of £10,000 by a company director from his company was recorded as theft, Section 1 theft. So they went into the same pigeonhole, and without diving into that pigeonhole and pulling apart all of the offences, it was tricky to work out what was a fraud and what was not. The other thing is we didn't have a Fraud Act. So we prosecuted fraud under various different pieces of legislation. The Theft Act, mortgage fraud, if it was a cheque, an actual physical cheque, we used procuring the execution of a valuable security. Section 24 of the Theft Act, I think. So we slotted frauds into all these other little bits of legislation where they got lost. And it wasn't until we started really bashing on the door of government and saying, look, you've got a real problem here. And they turned around and said, well, you know, if you say there's a problem, we'll do something about it. What we'll do is we'll try and measure fraud. So they created the National Fraud Authority. You remember them? They made some good adverts about fraud. And they started to record fraud. First of all, they said, well, what is fraud? You know, does it include tax fraud? Does it not include tax fraud? What sort of fraud does it do? So there was a lot of work done around what they were actually trying to count and what they were actually trying to measure. And every year they reported, guess what? Yep, the figures went up and up and up until finally the government decided they do away with the National Fraud Authority, which they did. But still didn't do anything, in my view, about the problem. The other thing was fraud became, I think, the crime of the crime most associated with the organised criminal in around 92, 93. And this was because we had at that time, you remember, really drastic rise in interest rates, and they were going up 14, 15%. And so some of the criminals were saying, hold on a second, why should I walk across the pavement with a shotgun and rob a bank when I'm going to get an unsympathetic jury, a very short trial, and a very long sentence if I don't get shot in the process? So what I'll do instead is I'll do a mortgage fraud. I'll just tell a few lies on bits of paper, and then people will give me money. And that's what's happened. And they did. And it was only when the interest rate drastically cut and went right down, then the building society started to repossess properties without making a profit on them. And they became land banks, and they started saying, oh, the shareholders started saying, we've got to do something about it. What should we do? Oh, we'll report it as a crime to the police. And suddenly the Metropolitan Police had to open a mortgage fraud department to cope with the humongous amount of crimes that are being reported to us. Janice mentioned the point about, you know, crimes being victimless or people not thinking very much about the victims. I've seen people kill themselves. I've seen people be made bankrupt. I've seen them borrow money off their families, off their cousins, off everybody they know. Look at the victims of Madoff. Look at those who committed suicide and those who stole money or borrowed money from others and wrecked their whole livelihoods. Why the poll that Janice mentioned is intriguing. If the public don't think it's a problem, and yet more and more members of the public are being affected by fraud, there's a disconnect somewhere there. I can't work it out. And lastly, the point I make about trials is they are tricky. I remember identifying one court at the Inner London Crown Court, which was the only court big enough to hold the original 8 defendants and 26 filing cabinets of paper exhibits that we took to the court for the start of a very long trial. So long, in fact, we had a jury catchment of 150 people, all of which had to tell the judge why they didn't want to, why they were going to get sacked or couldn't sit on that particular case. So why is it fraud? Why is it a non-priority? My 2-line answer is it's not been taken seriously enough by the governments over the years. It's been underfunded, and it's not a policing priority. If we change that, and that even when you look at the current fraud plan and the policing plan, the fraud plan is, if you like, a subsidiary of the policing plan. So I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. Excellent. I mean, you know, two outstanding, great insights. And I know we're going to get a third because we've got another expert. David, give us your thoughts on this subject, please. I'm interested.
I endorse everything been said. It sounds a gloomy picture, isn't it? You know, I think building on what's just been said, perhaps, because you've captured my views. You know, yeah, we know it's not a priority. We've been trying to learn from 2008, the financial crisis, and you know, Fraud Advisory Panel one great read from 2016. It was the businesses behaving badly about the financial crisis. Fraud. Remember, fraud led to the financial crisis. Mortgage fraud, commercial mortgage-backed securities, residential mortgage-backed securities to liar loans, all sanctioned, massive fines, took billions. And how many prosecutions from it? Almost none. Less than one place we can learn from, Iceland. They prosecuted people. We never fix those problems. This is why the public don't care. Who can afford to lose amongst us or any of our listeners £300,000, $400,000 and put into a Ponzi scheme? I don't think there's many of us. How many of us could afford to put £2,000-3,000 into a Ponzi scheme that's guaranteeing 10% a month? I don't think any of us on this call, and we're pretty sensible. So it genuinely doesn't affect most of the people. It affects a lot of people with money, and they're seen as targets. And people like Elizabeth, who I helped a couple of years ago, another one last year, giving away $1 million to romance fraudsters, is perfectly normal. Why would the public? And when I speak at OSCE and the UN and other countries, they're like, can you really afford to give away that much money? And I think here's the thing. There's that disconnect with many of our community don't see it. Many of our businesses don't see it. We see it. Last week, my company Guildhawk, we took a hit. It's only a small one. It's one project with a firm that's gone bust. And it's on the accountancy side again. They were forward booking their confirmations and their profits. And now they've gone under. So that was your Carillion thing all over again. I'm kicking myself that we didn't spot that one. It was a small job, fine. But we found one some years ago with Abengoa in Spain. They went under fraud. They were trying to give us details about changing the account details for invoicing, and we spotted it because of our systems. And honest businesses, as you said so well, Janice, and Tim, you know, from all the victim companies that we deal with, the honest companies, the ones who pick up the bill, they disappeared years ago. And it's like that. And what they've done is they disappear, and we've created a Western society, which is kind of like, it's a Robin Hood situation where Robin Hood steals from the taxpayer, you know, as a chat to the sheriff, and gives it to a rich gang of criminals. And and actually the worst thing is we celebrate them. You see them riding around in, you know, Ducatis, Maseratis, beautiful cars. They aren't drug dealers. They're just very close to the money. And what we've got to be so careful of, and I know the House of Lords said this, and I'll shut up. Why we've got to be careful is when people are greedy, when money's going out, like we've seen with the furlough, there's a lot of fraud there, National Audit Office. They're talking about National Crime Agency being eye-watering numbers of fraud, as we warned. And we're not putting controls in. It means we haven't learned from 2008. We didn't put controls in place. We cut police numbers when we should have been building up. It took us a year before we had the HMRC task force, and we're going to catch a cold, and it's going to be the good companies and honest people who'll pick up the bill. And I think there will be a Royal Commission actually a short time down the route saying what on earth happened. But it's something to do with that, Janice and Tim, I think, you know, with my 40 years in this space and now in the private sector, I think it's because we've got something underneath in our culture which says, yeah, it's all right to be make a bit of money, isn't it? And have the tax man and be a bit weird. You've got a big car and a big boat, you know. I'll go and photograph all these big boats in Monaco. There's something wrong with our setup, and then we blame the SFO, we blame the police, we blame the regulator. No, it's deep in our soul, and it was that thing called moral hazard.
David, thank you very much indeed for that. So I want to get on with the questions, if I might. I'm going to come to Tim and David, if I might first. You first, Tim. And Tim, one of the questions, this is right up the street of both of you, actually, and you'll see why. Jeff Eels asked this question. Is this about the fact that the policing sector is just the police officers just aren't skilled enough in terms of, as a group, in terms of tackling this? And look, the reason why it doesn't happen is because the police haven't got the skills to do it. His question is that true, and where do we look? Tim first, David second. Tim.
That's a really, really good question. And I hope I've got a really, really good answer. Firstly, the answer is yes, you're right. The second thing I want to add is this, is years ago, I wrote a paper called An Improved Response to Policing, and got it through up to the Commissioner of the Met Police, who took it to ACPO. And the suggestion was that we have a national fraud squad. And the idea, the concept was we'd have a fraud squad consisting, at the time, there were 244 detectives aligned to investigating fraud across the country. And the idea was that they would be given this very special status and become a national fraud squad. Because we said it would only work if we had officers that were dedicated and trained. And that didn't happen. It got rejected by ACPO, because if they said, if we have a national fraud squad, we'll have a national murder squad, we'll have a national robbery squad, and they rejected the idea out of hand. But as you can see, from now, when things go to action report to the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, these are crimes that are identified as being actionable, reportable, but what happens to them? So say, for example, a mortgage fraud comes along, and there's identified a banker, a valuer, a solicitor, and a crook. It's a small little tight package that a decent detective will be able to investigate quite quickly and quite thoroughly. What happens? It goes to somebody's desk in Dyfed Powys or in Somerset or in anywhere in the country where there hasn't been that sort of fraud, and the officers there don't know how to investigate it. So it ultimately gets put in the too difficult drawer, or it gets investigated very poorly or very badly indeed. There does need to be an upskilling. We upskill our people in technology. We make them able to deal with cybercrime, or that's a very slow process. But we should have done this with fraud, letters of credit fraud, shipping fraud, all these sorts of fraud. Unless you know what you're investigating, you can't do it properly. So there does need to be specific, specified officers trained in fraud, and there needs to be a lot more of them.
Thank you, Tim. David, you implied you disagree with that.
Yeah, I do actually. I think I don't disagree with the training side. Absolutely, we've got to keeping our people upskilled and up to date with things. Some of these things can be a bit complicated if you haven't dealt with one. But we've got the Fraud Act, the most fantastic piece of legislation we were given. Lying is an offence, cheating, people in positions of authority. And let's not forget, we have got, and I've seen this, I was a judge a couple of years on the awards, the TICA Awards, Tackling Economic Crime Awards. I've seen those fantastic submissions, where an old DS or DI has been retained in GMP, in South Wales, wherever, and they're actually there training on the ground, doing what good supervisors, managers do, turning out fantastic jobs, the best in the world. There's no one does it better than the British when we do it well. And that's not bad generally. Where the problem is, I go back to that point, we can't arrest our way out of this. As Janice said, 40% of all crime, is fraud. We know that is just the tip of the iceberg. There's even more now with this tsunami of fraud against, the taxpayer. And HMRC, they'll do their very best, but they can't take this on. We've got to look at the professional enablers. There are people there who are the gatekeepers, the barriers to this, who can spot it. And I go back to that point about, sharing data. Tim, you'll remember this. The data sharing discussion is back on there. And I was speaking at the Treasury Select Committee in July, and we talked about this. We're not sharing data. They're sitting on stuff. I've had conversations with 2 or 3 people recently who are shall we, applying for mortgages, and their income sounds incredibly fragile. And you remember that, Tim, from 2005, 6, 7, 8. I know when I was in the States looking at it, and you only have to have a little dig under the surface, say this is not right. We're going to inflation soon. We'll have some people and businesses won't be able to repay bounce back loans and stuff. That's what the Bank of England said recently, 55%. We will see companies and people going under, and that isn't the police's job to go and assess loans or mortgages or see if people actually have their income. And yet, as you say, Tim, we go back to that thing where suddenly on our desk comes, in the police, comes, oh, can you investigate this multiple mortgage fraud? Because, you know, we've been had over. Too late, absolutely wrong. And we keep blaming the old bill. No wonder so many of them want to leave and become train drivers and pilots. And well, maybe not pilots now, but they're going out for, they're not doing it for the money. They're doing it because they're fed up. You know,
So
these are
David,
easy things to detect.
David, can I just ask you, Jeff Eels has asked a specific question. I wonder if I could just very briefly, if you could comment on it. Is it the case that banks and insurance companies should suck out some of the resource into their privately funded police squads at the expense of public members of the police who are victims? In other words, do we have to be realistic? Just very quickly, if you wouldn't mind, Dave, because I want to move on. We're running out of time.
That we have a number of areas in the private sector and financial services where tremendous amounts of money flow through, and there's also enormous opportunities for fraud. That was the derivatives market in the early noughties, led to the 2008. Insurance have to say, yeah, they should be funding units to prevent, and then also supporting investigation. Let's not leave it until 2 years after it happened. Absolutely, they should be funding it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Going to move on, Janice. I wonder if I could ask you to comment, if you wouldn't mind. Jonathan Cooper says, would it be a good idea for prosecutors to rely on academics to produce victim impact statements on behalf of society? And the idea is that we've got to just sort of recognise that unless we understand victims' impact, then we're always on the run. And a sort of subtext to that is stop using the phrase victimless crime and start saying multiple victim crime. In other words, our language around this and our approach needs to differ, and we've got to be more victim focused. Janice, very briefly, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, I totally agree with that. It's some of the language that we use and the perception we have of fraud just has to change. It tends to only sort of focus our minds when we get affected ourselves. In terms of the actual victim side of it, then yes, definitely we need more information on the impacts this has on people. And I think the academic world at the moment is very much looking into this. And also I think the recent publication from the Victims Commissioner in the last week or so, that was an excellent article, publication for people to read, for people to understand more that the full impact fraud can have on individuals.
Yeah, okay, because it is significant. I think that's the point.
Very significant.
And part of this suggestion is to get more recognition to this impact. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Tim, Tracy Rogers, the reason why there's not a focus on economic crime is just too big a nut to crack, says Tracy Rogers. And so they are focused on things like good crime management, protecting their public image. And this is the problem, is it, Tim?
Yep. Yeah, very much so. And it's a nut that we've allowed to grow. An old detective superintendent said fraud was the Cinderella of crimes because it was locked in the back cupboard and nobody discussed it. Nobody wanted to talk about it because it was there, but it was always too big to tackle. Whenever there was a fraud investigation, if there was a murder, who would get pulled off their job? Fraud officers. They get taken because fraud wasn't that important. Nobody lost their life over it. So every time there was any other offence, fraud officers would be reappointed to something else. It's never been a policing priority. It should have been a policing priority. If it was, it wouldn't have got to be the huge, enormous thing that it is at the moment. But I agree, it is a nut that the government can't fund, and it's been lacking funding. And I agree with David, we can't arrest our way out of it, but we do need some resources to investigate it, at least put a lid on it.
Tim, thank you. I mean, David, a few years back, a chief constable said to me, that's for those of you overseas, the person in charge of police forces in the United Kingdom, says to me, the trouble with fraud is if we get too involved, it could overwhelm us. And it's back to this point that Tracy's raised about it's just too big a nut to crack. And so let's leave it alone.
No, it's not. You set a standard. This country's been in desperate times before. The 1930s were dreadful. The post-war period when my parents and grandparents were, getting through. We've been in bad times before. It's a moral compass thing. I think there is an issue though, and let's remember here, we're doing thought leadership for other businesses. We all, I'm sure, work with different boards and give advice. The ones who lead from the top, they want to do the right thing. Particularly, we're seeing this with furlough fraud, companies that broke the law, companies that followed the rules, and we're talking about companies that want to do. This country will get back on its feet. Those poor areas that are suffering particularly bad with employment will get on their feet because of SMEs, small, solid businesses that invest, grow, export, create skilled jobs in the UK, manufacture, and we've got to protect them. We wrote to the Chancellor about this, warning, make sure they're safe. This is about Brexit as well. Make sure they're safe. And what we've got to do now is educate and train. We're doing the same in Charity Fraud Awareness Week this week. It's International Charity Fraud. We're giving tools with the Charity Commission how charities can protect themselves. SMEs need that as well. They haven't got a Tim Harvey. They haven't got you, Martin, or you, Janice, or me to come in. Yes, we'll do it, as best we can to help, but we need to protect them. And one of the reasons why we won't go in further, I think, is simply the issue that you start digging. And as we've done already, what on earth's happened we've seen, little back deals, conflicts of interest. And Tim, with the Metropolitan Police and the City Police's lead role is they investigate corruption. And sometimes when that corruption goes to a certain place, like the businesses behaving badly, stop, we don't want to go there because there may be some. And we've got to be strong after this. Our good, solid, honest businesses will get us through this. It's going to hurt everybody. This ain't going to be easy, but it's better. Honesty is always the best policy. And the companies I'm seeing, 1.6 million companies in this country are SMEs. Most 90% of the country works for an SME. Who does all our international trade? We won our Queen's Award for international trade because we're investing all the time. And they're the companies we've got to help. But it's going to hurt. And we need to protect them and make sure they're not hurt. Otherwise, it affects our entire recovery over the next 25 years. And that's how we can help leaders.
Okay, and this is the point, Janice, I think, isn't it? One of the things you raised is the enormous impact, in your opening statements, the enormous impact on the economy. And I was just thinking, Janice, that back to this too bigger or too difficult a nut to crack. It does sound as if it is just in the too difficult box. There's no other logical explanation when you think about what you've all been saying about impact, consequence, and what have you.
No, I agree with you totally. And part of that is historical, as we've said. It's been defined differently. It's been viewed differently. It's included so many different acts over the year, different kinds of fraudulent acts. But now, we're in this position now where we have, as David said, a good fraud act. And it's now time to go forwards with this.
Okay, let me come back to David and Timmy. I want to come back to you on something really important. I want to talk about what we now do, and you two have both got a background in law enforcement, and Ewan Grant raises this point that a very low number of senior law enforcement personnel have pursued careers in tackling fraud. That may be revealing in itself. I expect it's true, or tackling economic crimes. And so there just isn't that sort of expertise. There isn't just that priority based on experience. And I wonder whether we need to do something different. Tim and David, Tim first, what does policing need to do? Because investing resources is always tricky in this age. Everyone's calling for it. It's not likely to be the sorts of things that's going to fall on welcoming ears. What's the big thing police need to do to deal with this issue about a lack of focus on skill sets and career senior people's understanding. Tim, headline issue, what are we going to do?
Well, I definitely agree with that. Luckily for me, through my career path, I've been investigating fraud all the way up to detective superintendent, and I didn't stop there. I continue with my own caseload. I found that I was one of the few senior officers that had any concept of what fraud is, or how companies work, how business works, whatever, because a lot of them have been brought up as PCs and then going on to being sergeants and inspectors, and they knew about violent crime, they knew about burglary, robbery, kicking the door off and bringing the drugs in, but they had no business acumen and no concept of how fraud actually operates and how clever and dedicated fraudsters actually are, knowing that they are as committed to their criminal enterprise as police officers are to their jobs. So we need to, there's an education aspect here, certainly in relation to senior officers, and we need a good strategy. The strategy that I've seen by the government at the moment, I think is very high leveled, but I think it lacks an on the ground plan for dealing with or reducing the problem as it currently exists.
Okay, thank you. And David, if I can ask you very specifically in your response, and I need you to be brief because we're running out of time. Jeff Eales makes this point. The reality is there is no system for effective intelligence sharing, prioritization and tasking of fraud responses. Is radical change needed, and how might it come about if so? Very quickly, David, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, Jeff's right, and he knows it from areas he's worked in. I just say again, stop thinking that the police will solve this. 100,000 people, of which a fraction of them are specialist fraud detectives with the systems. We've got the letter that we wrote from the Fraud Advisory Panel to 4 ministers and then wrote again this year. We did it last August, did it again this year. We have got a massive weakness in our systems. We need a crisis playbook. We need the banks to be able to have a central repository to show where money's going, because it can all look over it. If government money comes out from different departments and goes to criminals like COVID-19 showed, we need that. It's too late if the frauds, if 100 million has gone to an account in Latvia with 50p in it, it's too late to then say, oh, I need 25, 30 of Tim's best detectives to go and work with Interpol. You know, get the blinking system sorted out. Why are we not doing that? And we've written again, I'll keep going on like this with a broken record, how many hundreds of millions, even billions now, can be stolen by this bizarre Robin Hood situation until we say, let's fix it. So what we need is powerful AI. It's out there already. We know we've got it in service to be able to stop it at source. Then the police, with those excellent talent that we've got, best in the world, they then go and get some scalps of some serious players who are into a lot of things. And we bang them up for a long time and take as much money from them. And it doesn't matter how powerful they think they are. Businesses, honest businesses, will love the police for doing that, and they'll love the government. But we've got to convince people.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Jan, I suppose one thing we ought to just final comment say, and I mean 30 seconds if you wouldn't mind, academia itself hasn't been wholly committed to understanding all these impacts, and the subject is much neglected within the world of criminology too.
It is, yes, and I think we need to learn a lesson there in partnership as well, and learning, you know, and working with each other. Academia has a lot to offer government and businesses, and vice versa, and we need to work in partnership there. This is not something, as David said, we can arrest our way out of or solve on our own, or one group of people can solve. It needs an attack from a number of angles.
Panel, thank you so much indeed for your insights and your views. We could have gone on. I'd love to have gone on actually, but we stop at 45 minutes, as you know. Thank you very much indeed also to the audience for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through every single one, but there were just too many to be able to incorporate. Don't forget, a copy of this webinar will be going on the website tomorrow, and it'll be there forever, give or take. And I'll also be writing a blog which will be available tomorrow, and a copy of the report on which this idea was based. We'll send you details of where you can find that in the follow-up work. A few final comments, if I might, from me, very, very briefly, if you wouldn't mind. Just to say, Nominations for the Oscars are open in Romania, Ireland, India and New Zealand. You need to get your entries in. Make sure you're focused. Romania, Ireland, India and New Zealand. And also to say, what about coming to attend some award ceremonies? In Australia and Norway, they're virtual. The Tackling Economic Crime Awards, 6th of December. Virtual, amazing set of entries, fantastic, as David Clarke said. Do look out what's happening in Tackling Economic Crime Awards. Cyber Oscars virtual 14th of December, UK Oscars physical on the 24th of Feb. God willing, of course. And finally to say, we go through it all again in 2 weeks' time. And the reason it's 2 weeks' time is because next Thursday, on the same day, we've got the German Outstanding Security Performance Awards taking place in Essen, physical event. If you happen to be in Essen, come and join us. And also the Australian Outstanding Security Performance Awards, part of the industry awards there in Australia next Thursday. So 2 award ceremonies to attend if you wish. Hopefully you will. We're back in 2 weeks when we'll be looking at assessing the competence of security officers, what needs to change. So thank you very much once again to my panelists. Thank you very much indeed to the audience. Thank you very much indeed to Sarah Gray in the background who's been operating the system. I look forward to seeing you again soon. And until then, wherever you are in the world, stay safe.